welcome you to this program with David Sanger. I'm Jane Wales. I'm President and CEO of the World Affairs Council, and David is the author of an extraordinary book that we're going to hear about today. He is also, as you all know, David Sanger has been with the New York Times for, is it 28 years? With New York? How long have you been with the New York Times?
This August, 30 years. So.
30 years.
Yeah.
He's reported.
I joined when I was 7.
Yeah. He's reported from Washington. He's reported from Tokyo, from New York, and specialized over these years in foreign policy and national security issues, and the politics of globalization as well. We've all become pretty reliant on David's reporting over the years, but he has made a particular splash of late with his new book entitled Confront and Conceal: Obama's Secret Wars and Surprising Use of American Power. And so we're going to start with a conversation with you, David, and then I'm going to ask the audience to pass up their question cards, and I will integrate them into the conversation. So just real quick, in today's paper, Dianne Feinstein says she learned more from your book than she did as chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Say something about that.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's good news about the Senate Intelligence Committee. But no, Senator Feinstein said that she has not been an enormous fan of the book, is my sense from what I've seen in her public comments, because she's been concerned about leaks and so forth, and I actually think leaks is not the right word for how these kind of things come together, but we can get back to that. But the book raises, I wrote the book because the question that I had in my mind after writing The Inheritance, which we spoke about from the same stage a few years ago, was how did this turn out to be such a surprising American presidency when it comes to national security? You'll remember it was only 4 years ago that you had, in the midst of a presidential campaign, people on the left thinking that President Obama was the complete anti-war candidate because they weren't listening carefully to how he distinguished between Iraq and Afghanistan. They weren't listening when he said what he would be doing in Pakistan if he ever found bin Laden, and so forth. And you had people on the right who were using the phrase community organizer as a way of saying this is not somebody who has any experience in national security, which he had very little in, and were seeming to suggest was not ready to be commander-in-chief. So what happens? Both of these groups end up being surprised, Jane. The left is saying, did we sign up for somebody who uses drone strikes every few days or weeks? And the right is saying, gee, this isn't the guy we thought we had. And the book is an effort to try to explain how he got from where he was in the campaign to what we're seeing today.
Mm-hmm. Well, take us to that moment when he first came in as president and George Bush took him aside and urged him to hang on to two classified programs.
Yeah. So about 3 or 4 days before the 2009 inauguration, there was a meeting where President-elect Obama comes over to see President Bush, and it's just the two of them. This is a pretty traditional thing, happens during most changes in power. But in the course of that conversation, he said, there are 2 programs that you're not going to want to do without, even though you may initially have your doubts about them. And one is drones, and he described its import over Pakistan. This is before we were using them in Yemen and so forth. And the other was a remarkable secret program called Olympic Games, which had begun in the Bush administration and was, to President Bush's mind, the best chance that the United States and Israel had of avoiding war with Iran. Or at least avoiding an Israeli strike on Iran, if it was successful. But it was at a very, very nascent stage. And it's actually hinted at in the first pages of The Inheritance, which came out 2 weeks before this meeting took place, and I described that President Bush had authorized computer attacks. But we didn't know very much about what those were going to look like, and certainly didn't know the level of detail that we do now.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about what are the implications for our security over time of using cyber attacks. Obviously we have a big advantage in terms of the capacity to attack those systems that undergird not just military facilities, but civilian life. But we're also the most information-dependent country in the world, or one of them. What is our vulnerability going forward, and how have we thought about that at the same time that we're launching offensive strikes?
Well, as you delve into this account in Confront and Conceal, and by the way, Confront and Conceal is not just about infrastructure strikes against Iran. It's a book about Afghanistan and Pakistan and China and the Arab Spring and so forth. But this is a very central part of the light footprint strategy that the president's put together, and I'll get back to that in a moment. The core question that President Obama kept asking as he got briefed up on this program was, what precedent does it set if the United States is the first nation that ends up making sustained use of cyber weapons? And this has been sustained. I wasn't able to figure out how many strikes there were against Iran, but they started in the Bush administration, they accelerated in the Obama administration. So there have been many, many, and it took the Iranians until, I think, 2010 before they really figured out what was going on. And that was a fascinating story. It's actually the story the book begins with, and we'll get to it in a moment. But there was discussion about whether or not this sets a precedent and how vulnerable we are. And it was an important discussion because Olympic Games and Stuxnet, which is what escaped from Natanz and got named as the virus in the summer of 2010, and that's the moment the Iranians realized what was happening to them, was itself a very different kind of computer attack than what we're all used to. Almost all cyber attacks until now have been computer to computer. I have my laptop, go into your laptop, Jane, read those fascinating emails, clear out your bank account, whatever, and that's
what
the
went
kind.
wrong.
That's what happened. Okay, this was different. This was an effort to go through Iranian computers in order to get at the centrifuges in the underground site at Natanz, and to destroy them without bombing them from above, and without sending in a bunch of agents, sort of OSS style, as the way they did it in World War II, to blow them up on the ground. And it played off of an incredible vulnerability that the Iranians had. The Iranians had bought their centrifuges, or the initial ones before they started building them, from A.Q. Khan, who was the Pakistani rogue nuclear scientist. And these centrifuges, which the Pakistanis called P1s and immediately discarded because they are the Ford Pintos of the, there are probably people in this audience who are too young to remember Ford Pintos, but just imagine a car that would self-immolate, okay? So these would break down very frequently. And the insight, the sort of central insight that the US and Israel had in 2007, 2008, was that if they could get into the system and speed these centrifuges up, remember they're spinning at supersonic speeds, or slow them down very dramatically, they could destabilize them. And a destabilized centrifuge explodes and probably takes out all the centrifuges next to it, and takes out anybody who's standing next to it too, okay? So the trick was, could they get inside these computer systems? And the difficulty is that Iran, recognizing that, of course, that Natanz is a big target for the West, did what most American companies do, which is they created what they call an air gap, sort of an electronic moat around the whole facility. So it wasn't connected to the internet. So it's not as if you could dial into these computers. So somebody had to walk in the worm. And so the way the process began was that in the late Bush administration years, the first thing they did was send in what's called a beacon, which was essentially a program to make a blueprint of how the computer system in Natanz was connected to these thousands of centrifuges. And then the beacon had to phone home. It's kind of the ET of computer worms, okay? And send back that plan. once they had that, the United States and the Israelis built basically a mock-up of the entire Natanz enrichment plant. They spread this out over several Energy Department laboratories so that even inside the Energy Department, people didn't have an idea of what they were doing. But they did it at several of these facilities. And then they designed a worm to see if they could do what is delicately called destructive testing. And when it succeeded, they took the rubble of these P1 centrifuges and flew it back to Washington and dumped it on the conference room table in the sit room and brought President Bush down to see it. And it was at that moment that they then approved this to go on in a larger way. And they designed several versions of this, started in small ways, varied it each time. And for the first few years, the Iranians weren't quite sure what was going on. They thought that maybe they just had bad P1s. We know how unreliable these are because when Muammar Gaddafi gave up his nuclear weapons program, something he probably regretted last year that he had done, the United States got the centrifuges that had been in Libya, and they're the same kind that were going to Iran. So they had a whole group to test. And so as these started to blow up, the Iranians couldn't figure out what was going wrong. They actually fired people because they thought they were making technical errors. And it wasn't until the Stuxnet mistake that they figured out that they were under attack.
Yeah. So tell us what happened with Stuxnet. It then somehow the worm got onto the internet.
That's right. Right. So what happened was they kept dialing up this worm and making it more powerful because they were aiming at certain groups of centrifuges. And they made a programming error. Happens to all of us. How many times do you see, that Windows update that comes out to do the patch at the last minute that's always driving you crazy because you got to print something out and meanwhile your computer's updating? Well, turns out the same thing happens when you're sabotaging industrial plants. And so there was a mistake made. The program was living in Natanz, and one day an Iranian engineer came along and plugged in his laptop, I assume just to do routine maintenance. I don't think he had any idea what was going on. The worm leapt aboard his laptop. He packs up, goes home, and the worm did not recognize that its environment had changed. And so it ends up propagating itself out onto the internet thinking it was still inside Natanz. Mm-hmm. And suddenly there were millions of copies of this worm all over the world. It was predominantly at first in Iran, then it showed up in Indonesia, eventually it made its way here, and you could sort of map this out. And so a few weeks after this happened, they decided somebody really had to go down and tell the President of the United States they'd made a little mistake. And that job fell to Leon Panetta and two of his aides, and the book opens with the scene of them walking down into the Situation Room to describe to the president that there'd been a little error here, which I remind people when I hear members of the Congress on TV telling everyone that everything in this book, is designed to go make the president look like a strong leader. And I'm sure there are elements of it, and in drone stories that have appeared elsewhere, that every president wants to be seen down in the Situation Room making big decisions. But this book happens to open up with a big mess up. And they go down, they consider what happens. The president's very calm about it. The vice president is less than calm about it. He says some things that I can't say while we're recording this for radio or whatever, but you let your imagination go wild. And the president makes a decision to let the program continue for a while, figuring that the Iranians don't quite have a sense of what was going on yet. And that turned out to be a pretty good call because they came back with another version and then another one after that within a few weeks. And it was that third one that took out slightly under 1,000 centrifuges. Mm-hmm. Now, the Iranians have recovered. They're back producing again. If you graph their overall production of uranium, you see some blips in it, but they've come back. There's a big dispute among experts that I won't bore you with about how many months or years this may have set them back. But clearly, it slowed them down. And they overreacted to each attack because they didn't understand what was happening. So they closed down more centrifuges, took more of them out of the plant to try to figure it out.
And I mean, here, there's this advantage of kind of confusing them, obviously, part of the advantage, but also there are diplomatic advantages to ambiguity. Say a bit about that, because we went from a situation where a scientist was assassinated, another one was attacked, presumably by Mossad, on the one hand. On the other hand, the centrifuges would sometimes speed up, sometimes slow down, so that looked like just a glitch. From the Iranian standpoint, this could have been acts of God, right? I mean, there wasn't clarity as to the sources.
Yeah, initially there wasn't, until Stuxnet happened. And then when they saw the whole program out there, and scientists began computer engineers began to dissect the program. We were writing stories about this in 2010, and it became clear that this thing was designed specifically to hit the Natanz plant, because the program was written to affect arrays of a certain number of centrifuges. It took us a number of months to be able to go figure that out, and even that didn't tell you exactly who did it. But you're right, ambiguity was a big part of this, and President Obama wanted to keep the program secret for as long as he could. There were others, though, inside the US government who made the argument that even if you lost ambiguity, because they figured sooner or later this was going to become public, there was some value in the Iranians knowing that they were vulnerable to this, that the US could come back. So, there's considerable question about which is the way to go do it. But it raises the question, the ambiguity raises the question, why do you run a story like this? Which is the question I've been asked both politely and rudely in various emails over the past 9 or 10 days since the book came out, and 2 weeks since our excerpt appeared in the Times. And the answer is pretty simple. It wasn't news to the Iranians that they were under cyber attack. And in 2010, they said who they believed did it, and they didn't think it was Switzerland. In early 2011, we published a big front page story that was not in the middle of a presidential election and did not raise a big stink, but nonetheless said it was the United States and Israel. Didn't have the kind of level of detail that we had now about the breadth of Olympic Games, but just on this specific program. So we'd already declared that in the paper, and people could either believe it or not believe it, but we had said it. So then the question comes, do we want to be conducting cyber war if we are, as you point out, the most vulnerable country? Our cell phone networks, our aircraft control systems, I mean, what doesn't run in some way computer controlled? But secondly, do we need to have some kind of national discussion about what kind of rules you want to have for using this? And it's not the first time we've had a classified weapon system and still had a public debate on that question. Think of this. After the nuclear bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we spent the next 20 years as a country trying to figure out when and whether we wanted to use nuclear weapons. MacArthur wanted to use them in Korea. You had some people advising President Kennedy to go use them during the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was 50 years ago this October. It was really only after the Cuban Missile Crisis that a consensus developed that we really don't want to use these weapons except in the most extreme need to preserve the state. Then we had the same debate to some degree over chemical weapons, over landmines, where many countries have signed the treaty, but we haven't. And we've been having this debate now for 11 years over drones, a classified program, but we're still playing out the argument every single day about when is it appropriate to use drone technology. Sooner or later, we were going to have that debate on cyber war, and the revelations in Confront and Conceal and the discussion about this broader program, I think, may have sped that up modestly, but only by a little bit.
We'll turn to drones in a second, but one of the accusations, or at least what has been said in Washington, is this wasn't so much 18 years of hard work. It's much more of an orchestrated attempt on the part of Obama administration folks to paint a picture of him as a tough guy in the campaign. So I thought you might say a word about that.
Sure.
I think of you as an observer of policy, but you're also an observer of politics. And
the two are never far apart. Right.
Well, I keep wondering which is a more likely outcome, that Republicans will suddenly sign up in droves for Barack Obama, or that Democrats might say, gee, this is a guy who uses force more readily and more secretly than makes me comfortable.
Well, in this particular case, I think we're hearing a lot from Capitol Hill on this issue and from others, because we've run stories in the Times that ended up being fairly close together. A very big, fascinating story on drones that Scott Shane and Joe Becker did. Dan Kleidman of Newsweek has written a really interesting book also that focuses heavily on drones. And then Confront and Conceal came out, and this all happened in a few weeks' time. I'm sure that every White House I've covered since I ended my happy life as a foreign correspondent and came back to Washington, every White House I've covered, of course, wants to portray the president, whoever the president is, as strong, decisive, sitting in the sit room as the master of the whole policy. Of course they do. At the same time, when you look at these stories and take people who do reporting for a living and look at them, these are not the kind of stories, to my mind, that come out of somebody calling you up and saying, hey, can we drop a file on you of this program? It doesn't happen that way. It happens that way in the movies, but I've never yet talked to a source in a parking lot. And I've never moved potted plants around. So I was at work on this book for about 18 months. The serious work on it began just as we were writing that 2011 story about Stuxnet. And I pulled on that string and did a lot of digging over a good period of time. Now, at some point, sooner or later when you're doing that, you have to go to the government and say, here's what I've got. And you've got to pay significant attention to the question of whether or not there's anything operational that you've learned or anything that could endanger lives, and give people a chance who are knowledgeable about this to come back and say, this could be problematic in terms of an ongoing operation. And that's fairly standard procedure for the New York Times. I mean, we've been at this for some time now and it's exactly what happened in WikiLeaks, a year and a half ago. We went through 250,000 cables. It's an unpleasant task to have 250,000 cables dropped on you. But we went through them, and before we published them, about a week before, we sent to the State Department the 100 or 150 cables we were writing from and said, if there's something truly vital in here, let us know. And we engaged them over a very short period of time and ended up doing some deletions, as we've said before. It's reasonable to assume the same procedure is pretty standard.
I'm going to go back, though, to drones for a second, if we might, because I'm sure we'll get question cards about the leaks or the disclosures. Here's a situation where we have the kind of pinpoint accuracy that allows us to assassinate individuals. What are the set of issues that this has raised? How has the State Department, legal counsel, looked at these questions? And in particular, we had a situation in which we assassinated an American citizen in Yemen. Talk about the legal implications and the policy implications more broadly.
Well, there's a section of the book called Drones and Cyber that tries to examine the question, how have we set up a structure to do the drones? And then, is there a parallel structure we built for cyber? And to rush ahead to the conclusion, there is now at least a set of standards on drones that they've had to go out and make public, even though it's a classified program, because the people have been asking exactly that question, and I'll loop back to it. There is not yet that same kind of structure on cyber that at least anyone's been willing to describe to me. And I think maybe it's just that it's so new that, we're in that moment sort of more similar to 1946 with nuclear weapons or 2003 or 2004 with drones. I mean, that's sort of where we are in cyber right now. On the drone issue, Harold Koh, who's the State Department legal counsel, came in, looked at the drone issue, and said, we need to finally get out and explain what the legal basis is and how this fits into fundamental legal laws of war. And he did so in a speech that he gave, I think, in 2010. And then you've seen President Obama earlier this year talk about drones publicly for the first time. And then you saw John Brennan go out and give one or two speeches where he also lays this out. And essentially the argument is this, that Congress authorized a certain set of actions against Al-Qaeda and its affiliates in the days after 9/11. And then there were other legal bases that make using the drones in Afghanistan fairly simple. But in the case of Pakistan or Yemen, you're going after groups that are considered to be in transit but still plotting against the United States. And the argument the US has made is that it only does these drone attacks in countries that invite them in onto their territory, or a place where there's no functioning government. So you have no other choice but to go in. You don't have a government to go negotiate with. Somalia would be an interesting
I'm just trying to think
example.
and how does Pakistan fit into the...
Well, Pakistan was a really good argument when I was first going around to ask the question, and the military was, did have a tacit agreement that was the worst kept secret in Washington to allow in the drones. And in fact, at that time, there were some drone bases in Pakistan. The drone bases in Pakistan have since been closed, and the duly elected Parliament of Pakistan, which we're always trying to support so that we're not just dealing with a group of military leaders, passed a series of recommendations, not a firm resolution, about a month and a half ago, recommending that all foreign drone strikes end in the country. And since that time, by my count, they've accelerated quite considerably. And it gives you a sense of how fractured the relationship with Pakistan is. And there's an extremely long chapter in the book that takes you through the bin Laden raid, but then what the aftermath of that and how it took a fractured relationship with Pakistan and made it completely dysfunctional. Mm-hmm. The administration has not fully answered the question of how it can continue these in Pakistan when the parliament has fundamentally requested that they cease. And it does raise the question, who are they listening to, General Kiani or the parliament? Now, the Pakistan-Afghan sections of the book open with a secret meeting between Tom Donnellan and Kiani in Abu Dhabi in October, where Mr. Donnellan, who's the national security advisor, basically says, look, someone's going to have to go after the Haqqani network, which had just done a siege on the U.S. embassy in Afghanistan a few weeks before.
This is a criminal network.
Criminal network that's operating inside Pakistan, and which many believe operates at least with the general guidance of the ISI, the Pakistani intelligence service. And the question was, were the Pakistanis going to go after them, or was the U.S.? And Mr. Donnellan's essential message was, if you didn't like the bin Laden raid, you're really not going to like what happens when your sovereignty is violated to go after Haqqani, but we can't have this group of people killing American troops, and that's the ultimate responsibility of the President of the United States. And it's a very confrontational, polite but confrontational meeting taking place in the sort of prim living room of this townhouse that belongs to an intelligence service friendly to the Pakistanis. I start the section with it just to give you a sense of just how much this relationship has completely frayed. And you're seeing it play out every day now with the Pakistanis closing off the routes in to supply the troops in Afghanistan.
Yeah. So just step back for a moment and say something about what our interests are in Pakistan. I mean, here is a very weak state with nuclear weapons that is, a direct route for, at least for Al-Qaeda and for the Taliban, back and forth, and no longer a route for us to cross that border.
No longer a route for us, at least for the supplies. When President Obama came in, he knew he wanted out of Iraq, but he needed to conduct a number of studies of Afghanistan, and the studies he conducted really changed the way he looked at the problem. The Bush administration had signed on Pakistan as a necessary ally on the way into Afghanistan. But in the course of that, I think it sort of blinded itself to the fact that came up out of the Afghanistan-Pakistan reviews that President Obama did, which is that Afghanistan really no longer poses a direct threat to the United States. I mean, if Al-Qaeda was meeting again and training in Afghanistan, we would see it in a way we weren't prepared to see it prior to 2001, thanks in part to the drones. But Pakistan is 180 million people or more, the center of the insurgency, far more Al-Qaeda and dangerous forms of Taliban in Pakistan, which dangerous meaning that they're plotting against the United States, and 100 or more nuclear weapons, including a new generation of highly portable tactical nuclear weapons that they are building to be able to move weapons directly to the Indian border. And those are weapons that are much easier to steal. And I think that the Obama administration came pretty rapidly by the end of 2009 to the conclusion that America's interests in the future of Pakistan are much stronger than America's interests in the future of Afghanistan. And if they had any doubt about that, it was pretty well cleared up in 4 days in 2009, described in a chapter called The Bomb Scare, when the National Security Agency listened in on a conversation among the Pakistani Taliban and thought that what they were hearing was a conversation in which the Taliban leaders are boasting about obtaining either a nuclear weapon or the makings of a dirty bomb. And it wasn't entirely clear. And for about 4 or 5 days, this completely gripped the administration, although they kept it quite secret. The president sent a nuclear search team to the Gulf. They didn't send them into Pakistan. They asked the Pakistanis, excuse me, can you guys do a count? Anything missing? And the Pakistanis came back and said nothing was missing, but of course they won't tell you how many weapons there are.
I was going to say, would they know? Do they know what the delta is? Do they know what they have by way of material as well as weapons?
They certainly know what they have in by way of weapons. Material is always a bit of a problem because in the processing of nuclear material, a certain amount gets lost in the production, in the pipes, inventory shrinkage. And if you go back into WikiLeaks and you read the cables from Ann Patterson, who was then the American ambassador to Pakistan, back to the State Department, at the same time that President Obama was giving press conferences saying we have no concerns about Pakistani nuclear security, she's writing back these detailed notes about the concern that a really dedicated group could take a few grams of material at a time and that you'd never really notice the difference because things do get stuck in the pipes and over time could accumulate enough for a weapon. What really disturbed the administration in 2009 was that the Pakistanis did not appear to have a very high-tech way to go search for material, and it's really a needle in a haystack problem in any case. Now, within a few days, this problem dissipated, and they came to the conclusion either that they had translated the conversations wrong or that the Taliban groups had been scammed by Russians or others. And it happens more often than you would think, where people believe they're getting real nuclear material and they're not. But it focused the attention of those in the administration who were sort of new to this, and it suddenly gave them a vision of how the politics of this would change if ever there really was the loss of significant nuclear material.
Earlier on in this conversation, you noted that that Gaddafi probably at one point really regretted giving up his nuclear weapons. I mean, at the point at which he was faced with a coalition in opposition. Moving over to the Iranians just for a moment. Right now, they worry about an attack by Israel or us. If they had nuclear weapons, they wouldn't have that worry.
Even if they just had a nuclear weapons capability where everybody in the world believed that they could put a weapon together fairly quickly, but they could still plausibly make the case that they hadn't left the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, they'd probably give them pause. I mean, look, it's a great thing that Muammar Gaddafi is gone. The Libya operation was a great success if you don't count the fact that NATO ran out of ammunition fighting an enemy that couldn't fight back. But it did set a precedent that you got to think about for a moment. I mean, here was a rogue state actor who voluntarily gave up his nuclear materials and equipment. He had not gotten very far in his nuclear program. By the time those centrifuges arrived back in the United States, most of them were still in boxes with Khan Research Laboratory just barely blacked out by the United States for when they let us come down and see this stuff. But the first time that he ran into trouble, the US and NATO helps push him out by bombing his troops and then hunting him down. It was an American stealth aircraft that in the end identified the motorcade that he was in when he was captured and killed an hour or two later. If you're Iran or North Korea and you're listening to the United States say you must give up all of your nuclear infrastructure, and you look at what happened to Gaddafi, it must be a really interesting sort of meeting of their National Security Council about whether that's such a bright idea.
Mm-hmm. One of the question cards asks, in essence, actually, let me just back up because I've got 3 question cards going in my mind right now. But you've referred to the doctrine of a light footprint. And then you just mentioned the response to Libya. And of course, there has not been a similar response to Syria. What did you learn in your reporting about our doctrine when it comes to the responsibility to protect? This notion that a sovereign state is obliged to protect its citizens from mass atrocities. If it fails to do so, the international community can and should step in. What did you learn about that?
Well, my academic friends in the audience, and I see a few here, would rip me apart if I didn't start by defining my terms. So what is a light footprint strategy here? I think President Obama came in and came fairly rapidly to the conclusion that the era of big land war invasions where we send 100,000 troops and spend $1 trillion and occupy a country for 5 or 6 years and discover we can't change its fundamental wiring, and then we leave, that we no longer have either the political tolerance or the money to go do that again. So what drones and cyber and the use of special forces all have in common is that they are part of this light footprint strategy, where you go in using America's technological advantage, you do what you can to set back a threat, and you get out of town in a big hurry before you have to get into an occupation that the local population resents and that turns out to be a lot more expensive than you just told Congress you intended on spending. Who wouldn't want a light footprint strategy? And it's very good for some things. It's great for targeting a group of terrorists in a living room. It's pretty good, as we've learned, for targeting 1,000 centrifuges in a basement in the desert. It's not so great for rebuilding societies, sending girls to school, making a population in a small town in Afghanistan feel secure, teaching them how to go build up agriculture or build up business or search for minerals so that they are not ripe for the Taliban coming back in. It doesn't help you with any of those problems. So in Libya, the light footprint approach worked. And it worked in part because the Libyan military was fairly easy to crack. And it worked in part because geography, it turns out, still does matter in international relations. So all of you who took those geography courses, you didn't lose everything. And you could see the Libyan military massing out in the desert. There was an opportunity to strike them. And you remember all that talk about no-fly zones and so forth at the beginning of the Libyan thing. There's a scene in the book where President Obama sits down in the sit room and he's being asked, he's being briefed on a no-fly zone. And he says, they don't have airplanes. What's a no-fly zone going to do for us? This meeting isn't worth happening. I'm going to dinner, come back with a plan to actually take out the troops. And by the time he got done with dinner, they actually had one, and that's what they did. And you see, you thought everything happened solely in Washington. Syria is completely different. This is a civil war taking place in incredibly crowded cities. If you bomb them, you'd have huge civilian casualties. So it was pretty easy in the Libya case to go up and give a speech, as the president did at the end of March last year, about the responsibility to protect, though he didn't use that phrase. And he didn't use it for a very deliberate reason. He didn't want to get stuck with people coming back the next time and saying, you're not following through on this. But he basically defined why it was necessary sometimes to use force to protect people from their own leadership. And he did this again, he did this really for the first time in the speech he gave when he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize. And he sort of surprised the Peace Prize jury by devoting the speech to those moments when the President of the United States had to use force. But he laid out this doctrine. In the Syria case, though, to the president's mind, it fails almost every test that he's put out. First, you can't do it without big collateral damage. You could in Libya. Secondly, the Syrian military is showing no sign of cracking because they are made up of Alawites, as is President Assad's group as well. And so it's all or nothing for them. If they lose this, they and their families are finished. And thirdly, the president has said repeatedly he does not want to put troops on the ground. Been there, done that. And nobody has come up with a good plan for Syria that you can do without putting troops on the ground. And we're just back in that discussion. And also you've got the Russian opposition, which has blocked all of this.
Yeah,
right.
And what is the role of Russia also in supplying arms?
Well, first of all, Russia's got a big interest in Syria because Syria is the host to its only outside of Russia naval base, just as Bahrain is critical to us, and we said very little about the uprising in Bahrain as a result. Secondly, the Russians appear to be supplying arms. I was at a lunch with Secretary Clinton on Monday, I guess it was, where she made this announcement about helicopters coming from Russia to support the Syrian military. It now looks like what she may have failed to mention was these were Syrian helicopters that went back to Russia for servicing and were about to get returned. But nonetheless, her point was the Russians are keeping this going and keeping Assad in power. And the Russians feel as if the United States abused the authorities given to it by the UN in Libya's case and turned a humanitarian mission into a hunt for Gaddafi. And they're right. That's exactly what happened. And it happened because NATO concluded and the Arab League concluded that you weren't going to be able to complete the humanitarian mission if everybody thought that Gaddafi was going to come back.
Mm-hmm. Where's the American public on this question? And I notice your colleague Nick Kristof has written extensively about Syria and his sense that we are failing morally as a country for not going in. Where do you think the American public is on that?
When you look at polls, the American public is in one of those modes, fully understandable, that we've been at war now continuously since September 12th, 2011. 2001. So we've had 11 years of this, and they don't want foreign intervention. At the same time, there is a strain you're hearing mostly from Governor Romney and from some in Congress that makes the case that the U.S. can't be in a position of giving up leadership. And that's the other side of the Obama doctrine that's likely to get debated during the campaign. Because while the president has made it pretty clear that he's willing to use unilateral American force if there is a direct threat to the United States, think the bin Laden raid, think Olympic Games, think about any of the drone strikes in Pakistan where they're going after groups that they believe could mount attacks in the US. When there is just a general threat to the civic order, like Syria, like Libya, he is insisting that countries that have a more direct interest take the lead and that they put real skin in the game. So he wouldn't act in Libya until NATO took the lead and the Arab League was in and had invited this action. And the same thing's happening in Syria, but in Syria there's much more division, so the international system sort of seized up. And that's what's starting this debate about whether or not the United States should be showing leadership, which is a way of saying acting unilaterally if the world can't get its act together, or whether we say that our era as the world's policeman, even in cases where our interests are indirect, whether that should be over at this point.
Let's talk a little bit about the Arab Spring, because a few of our questioners ask you to paint a picture of the president's response to developments in Tunisia and then rapidly in Egypt.
Yeah. So the president was sort of out ahead on the Arab Spring, and then I think lost some momentum in this past year. Out ahead because in the summer of 2010, just before he went on summer vacation, he signed a secret presidential study directive asking a group within the White House to look at the fragility of many of the countries in the Arab world and come back with some assessment of what would happen if they collapsed. And they kept it secret because they didn't want the Saudis or Bahrain or whoever else they were studying to be reading in the New York Times that the president was sort of interested in what happens when their regimes go down. It's always disturbing when you pick your paper up and you see that, right? But of course, they immediately told us about it after the Arab Spring began to make it clear that the president was out ahead. I think it reflected to some degree a frustration with what he was getting from the intelligence community about the possibilities of this, and that became clear when Tunisia broke out and the president asked his briefers one day, so what are the chances this is going to spread to Egypt? And the answer came back, oh, very small chance, sir. Okay, so then Egypt happened. And I think one of the most poignant moments that I tripped into in looking at the president's record was I got my hands on a transcript of the last conversation between the president and President Mubarak, which you'll read about for those of you who page through the book. And it's this astounding conversation. Mubarak was supposed to resign, the White House had been told, or announce his resignation. Instead, he got on TV and he gave these very defiant speeches. And President called him and said, you know, sir, you've been running the country for 30 years, since I was in college. I respect my elders, but I really think it may be time to ease this moment out. And he's very polite, sort of indirect. And Mubarak comes back and says, you don't understand the situation. I understand the situation. Nasser put one of these down, President Nasser, 30 years ago. Give me 10 days. It's a direct quote. Give me 10 days, and this will all be cleaned up. We'll talk then. And it was sort of code word for give me a few days to kill all these people, and you won't be looking at this on your TV screens. And Obama comes right back at him and says, I really don't think you understand this, and basically hints to him that his own military is not likely to back him and go do that because there had been enough back-channel conversation with the Egyptian military to make it clear that they probably were not going to support an 82-year-old dictator who wanted to put his son in place, and his son was not the favorite of the Egyptian military. That was the last time the two men ever spoke, and I'm sure will be the last time they ever do speak. There had been a fascinating debate, though, within the White House about whether to push Mubarak out, or, you know, it's Mubarak who threw himself under the bus. I guess the question was, do you back the bus up and down over him a few times, right? And it was Secretary Clinton, among others, who said, you know, I wouldn't push him out until you know what's going to follow, because you could end up with a government that was quite different. And there was a young group within the White House, aides who could pretty much imagine themselves in Tahrir Square, who were saying, you've got to get on the right side of history on this one. How many times did you hear that phrase during this? And so I'd heard this from administration officials, and when I finally went to see Secretary Clinton, I asked her about it, expecting her to sort of say, well, you know, it's a complicated time, there are a lot of moving parts. And instead she said, you know, I absolutely said to him, you know, you want to be careful that you don't push him out until you understand what follows. And she said, I also told the president that I thought this would work out all right, but it might take 25 years before we get there. And so what happened after that? The US went on to announce that it would support democratic movements across the region, with the caveat that there were some moments when our interests would overtake our values. That was code word for Bahrain, right, where the Fifth Fleet is located and is running its operations against Iran. And there's been very little new money coming in. So I went with a couple of my research assistants. We took a little field trip to Egypt in this January, to be there a year after the uprising and just see what things were like. So here was the scene. First of all, there were a group of American senior officials there saying, you know, we give $250 million in civilian aid and $1.3 billion in military aid to Egypt. We think we might get out of Congress another maybe $50 or $100 million, maybe even $200 million. Well, they were saying this in January when Egypt was spending $2 billion a month just supporting its currency. Mm-hmm. So, and we were living in this world where, you know, we were thinking that a couple $100 million was going to make a big difference to them. I went to the Muslim Brotherhood Party's headquarters and spoke with them. I was with Tom Friedman and David Kirkpatrick, and they talked us through what their plans were, and of course, a lot of their plans have changed since. But at the end of the conversation, one official said to me, you know, it's interesting that you're up here in the conference room, because you know who was here a couple of days ago? I said, who? He said, the Chinese. What they want to know? He said, well, they think the Suez Canal is looking a little shabby these days. You know, needs entirely new cargo handling facilities, needs basically to get rebuilt. Not much has happened there since the 50s. And they may be interested in actually financing. In fact, they could manage the whole place. And so when we get into these aid debates, you know, we're still thinking in 1960s or 70s terms as if we're the only one playing this game. And it's not quite that simple these days.
So help us understand a little more about what did follow in Egypt from politically. How should we understand the role of religion in politics there? Because I think we have a tendency to sort of see Iran as the model, right, of what happens. But might it be Turkey as a more relevant model? What is the role of religion in politics?
You know, we would like to think that Egypt's going to move in the way of Turkey, which is to say to have an Islamic-based but fundamentally secular government. The Egyptians don't seem to want to run an Iranian-style model. And I think that the way Iran has been sort of isolated in the region in recent times has probably helped drive them more to that thought. But Egyptian society is incredibly divided on these issues. It's divided between urban and rural, no surprise there. I think that one of the biggest surprises in the Egyptian elections, which were just going on when I was there in January, was that not only the Muslim Brotherhood won 47% of the seats, but that the Salafists, the really hardcore religious group, won 25% of the seats. Now, this may all be thrown into a hat by this court decision just in the past day that seems to invalidate parts of the election. But the essential message of that election was that we had all vastly underestimated how well the Islamists would do in the election. Now, at the same time, the Muslim Brotherhood, at least in what they say when you show up as a New York Times reporter, which may be a little bit different than what they say to their home constituency, is we understand that business is dead in Egypt. We need the tourism. Tourism's a huge amount of what's involved here. And you can't do that and still ban booze in the Western hotels and bikinis on the beaches, right? And so you're going to see this struggle between their economic imperative and their religious desires, and it's going to be 2 steps forward and 1 step back and vice versa for a long time. And they are suffering. I mean, we went to the Egyptian Museum. I don't know if any of you have been to Egypt and been there. I can see from the nods you have. You probably remember the huge crowds that used to be there. I walked through with 2 of my research assistants, and we were the only Americans and nearly the only tourists in the Egyptian Museum. It was us and the mummies. And then we went out to the pyramids one day, and we were the only Americans out there. There were a couple of Arab visitors, but nothing like you would normally see. And the entire economy is just sort of grinding down. And that's what worries me the most, because that's when people begin to reach for truly extreme solutions.
Yeah. I'm going to take you to one point in the book that really surprised me, as opposed to the points in the book that sort of surprised me. And that was when you turned to the bin Laden, to the raid, ultimately the hunting down of bin Laden. You referred to it as something that had been put on the back burner. Say a word about what?
Sure. Been put on the back burner by the CIA, by others during the end of the Bush administration. This surprised me too. And I have to tell you that I've had many people in the intelligence agencies come to me since I wrote that and say they don't believe that within the agency it had been. But when President Obama came in and he looked at how the effort had been organized, he thought there was very little focus and that the effort had sort of lost its energy. And he pulled Director Panetta, now the Secretary of Defense Panetta, aside in 2009 and said, I want there to be a much bigger priority on this. And then Tom Donilon wrote up a sort of document that got that going. Now, people in the intel community say, you know, whatever documents they signed, it wasn't like they needed to get a memo reminding them that bin Laden was still out there. But there wasn't a whole lot of concentrated effort. I do describe in the book some previous efforts that had failed to find bin Laden. There was one brilliant idea they had that just didn't work. They saw bin Laden making all of these videos, and the videos, as you remember, weren't terribly good. And they figured at some point bin Laden would decide that he really needed an upgrade of his equipment. So they flooded the markets in Peshawar with these video cameras that had little tracking devices in them, figuring that sooner or later somebody would buy one and lead them to bin Laden. And it was just an inspired idea. But you know, I guess it was a budget crunch and they never bought themselves new equipment. And then, of course, they found the couriers and made their way on that way.
So David Sanger, I want to ask the members of the World Affairs Council to join me in thanking you so much for this conversation.
Thank you.
Tonight.